The muffled sobs of a little girl echoed through the airplane cabin, her tear-streaked face turned toward her mother. "Why do they hate us, Mommy?" Olivia whispered, her innocent voice trembling with confusion and fear. Her mother, calm but with a quiet fire in her eyes, stroked her curls and whispered, "It's not about us, sweetheart. Sometimes people forget to see others for who they truly are." From the crew section, Sarah watched. Her heart raced, her mind consumed by a swirling mix of guilt and denial. They don't belong here, she had told herself moments earlier. But now, staring at the tears of a child, tears she had helped cause, something inside her shifted. What began as a routine flight spiraled into a collision of assumptions, prejudices, and the unexpected revelation of a family's true power. Little did Sarah know, the very passengers she sought to diminish were the Johnsons, a family with the influence to bring an airline to its knees. And now, the turbulence wasn't in the skies, but in Sarah's heart. Would this moment define her as a villain? Or could she find a way to rewrite her story? What would you do if faced with a mistake so big it could destroy everything? Would you have the courage to face the truth and change? Let us know. Where are you tuning in from today? It's always amazing to see where our stories travel. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button. We're here to share more tales of resilience, hope, and the power of kindness. Don't miss the next chapter in our journey to inspire change, one story at a time. Let's dive into this powerful journey together. The final boarding call for Flight 218 echoed through the airport lounge. The air hummed with a mix of hurried conversations and the rustling of boarding passes. In the more secluded section reserved for first-class passengers, the atmosphere was calmer, but carried an unspoken air of exclusivity. Into this world stepped the Johnson family. Mr. Johnson, a tall, confident man with an air of quiet authority, led the way, his hand resting lightly on the shoulder of his daughter, Olivia. She skipped slightly to keep up, her floral dress bouncing with each step. Mrs. Johnson followed closely, her posture graceful, her sharp gaze taking in every detail of her surroundings. Their arrival turned heads, though not necessarily for the reasons they deserved. The elegance of their attire and the warmth in their smiles did little to mask the tension that followed them like an invisible cloud. First class was a space where judgments whispered louder than greetings, and the Johnsons, for all their composure, became the unspoken center of speculation. Sarah, the senior flight attendant for the flight, noticed them immediately. Standing near the counter, she watched as Mr. Johnson handed over their boarding passes. The younger attendant processing them offered a smile, but Sarah's brows furrowed. There was something about the family's effortless ease that made her uncomfortable, though she couldn't put her finger on why. "First class, all three of them," the younger attendant announced with a professional tone. Sarah forced a smile as the family approached. "Welcome aboard," she said, her voice flat. Mr. Johnson nodded politely, but as they passed, Sarah's eyes lingered and her smile dropped. As Sarah prepared for the flight's departure, a familiar voice cut through her thoughts. "Sarah," William Grant said, his tone low and conspiratorial. A regular passenger and one of the airline's most loyal clients, he often used his time in the sky to share unsolicited opinions. "Did you see them?" "See who?" Sarah asked, though she already knew. "The Johnsons," he replied, nodding subtly toward the family as they settled into their seats. "Interesting, isn't it? You have to wonder." He trailed off, letting his implication hang in the air. "Wonder what?" Sarah prompted, against her better judgment. "How people like that find their way into places like this," he murmured, his voice so low it was almost drowned out by the boarding announcements. Sarah said nothing but glanced at the Johnsons again. Olivia was already pressing her nose against the window, marveling at the planes on the tarmac. Mrs. Johnson adjusted her seatbelt while Mr. Johnson opened his laptop, his demeanor focused yet calm. William leaned back in his seat, a smirk playing on his lips. "Don't let appearances fool you," he said. Sarah didn't respond, but as she walked down the aisle, the seed of doubt had been planted. The flight took off smoothly, with passengers settling into their routines. The hum of the engines and the dim cabin lighting created a sense of calm. Olivia chattered excitedly about the view outside, her voice soft but brimming with curiosity. "Mum, look at the clouds!" she exclaimed, her small finger pointing at the window. Mrs. Johnson smiled. "Beautiful, aren't they?" Sarah walked past their row, her gaze lingering. It wasn't anything overt, just a flicker of something. Disapproval, suspicion, that crossed her face before she moved on. The first sign of tension came during the drink service. Olivia, ever the curious child, pressed the call button to request a glass of water. Sarah arrived promptly, but with a stiffness that was hard to miss. "Can I have some water, please?" Olivia asked, her voice polite. Sarah hesitated, her eyes flicking briefly to Mrs. Johnson before answering. "I'll get to it when I have a moment," she said curtly, turning away without another word. Olivia frowned, looking at her mother. "Did I do something wrong?" Mrs. Johnson smoothed her daughter's curls, her expression calm but firm. "No, darling, you did nothing wrong." Mr. Johnson, seated beside them, glanced at his wife. There was no need for words. The tension was palpable. As the flight progressed, Sarah found herself increasingly fixated on the Johnsons. Every request, every interaction seemed amplified in her mind. When Mr. Johnson politely asked for a replacement fork for his meal, Sarah sighed audibly before responding. "I'll see what I can do," she said, the words clipped. The final straw came during dessert service. Olivia, reaching for her ice cream, accidentally tipped her spoon, sending it clattering to the floor. The sound was hardly disruptive, but Sarah was there in an instant. "This isn't a playground," she snapped, her voice louder than necessary. Olivia's eyes widened, her lower lip trembling. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her small hands clasping together in her lap. Mrs. Johnson's voice was measured but carried an unmistakable edge. "It was an accident. Is that how you address all your passengers?" Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but William Grant chimed in before she could. "Don't take it personally," he said, directing his comment to Sarah. "Some people just don't understand the decorum expected in places like this." The silence that followed was suffocating. By the time the flight neared its destination, Sarah had convinced herself that the Johnsons didn't belong in first class. It wasn't just about their actions, it was their presence, their demeanor, the way they carried themselves with an ease that felt out of place. In the crew area, Sarah exchanged glances with William. He nodded as if to affirm her unspoken thoughts. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "it's up to us to maintain the balance." Sarah returned to her duties, but his words echoed in her mind. When she walked past the Johnsons one last time, Olivia looked up at her, still smiling despite everything. Sarah averted her gaze. In her heart, a decision had been made. "If they don't belong," she muttered under her breath, "I'll make sure they feel it." The chapter ends with Sarah staring out the small crew window, her reflection in the glass distorted, much like the assumptions clouding her judgment. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, a low and constant vibration that provided a backdrop for the quiet activities of the first-class passengers. Some flipped through magazines, others scrolled on tablets, while a few reclined their seats to rest. Yet, the Johnson family's rows seemed to exist in a bubble of subtle tension. Olivia sat by the window, her small hands clasped tightly in her lap as she peered out at the endless expanse of clouds. Though her curiosity about the sky remained, the carefree excitement she had shown earlier was now tinged with caution. Every movement she made was deliberate, careful, as if afraid of disturbing the fragile atmosphere. Her father, Mr. Johnson, was focused on his laptop, typing rapidly as he reviewed documents for an upcoming presentation. His demeanor was calm, but the set of his jaw and the occasional glance toward Sarah betrayed the thoughts swirling beneath the surface. Beside him, Mrs. Johnson held a magazine, though her eyes rarely left her daughter. "Mom," Olivia whispered, breaking the silence. "The clouds look like cotton candy." Mrs. Johnson smiled softly, brushing a stray curl from her daughter's face. "They're beautiful, aren't they?" "Mm-hmm," Olivia murmured, leaning closer to the window. Sarah, stationed near the galley, watched the family from the corner of her eye. The sight of them, so composed, so quietly dignified, stirred something in her she couldn't quite name. Resentment? Distrust? She couldn't pinpoint it, but it was there, gnawing at her, fueled by William Grant's earlier words. "They don't belong here," his voice echoed in her mind. The call button for row 3 lit up, snapping Sarah out of her thoughts. She straightened her blazer, picked up her tray, and walked briskly down the aisle. "Excuse me," Mr. Johnson said when she reached their row, his tone polite but firm. "My daughter's meal is missing utensils. Could we get a replacement, please?" Sarah hesitated for a fraction of a second, her gaze flicking to Olivia, who was looking down at her tray with a shy expression. "Of course," she said, though her words lacked warmth. She turned on her heel and made her way back to the galley, her steps heavier than necessary. By the time she returned with the utensils, her irritation had grown. She placed them on the tray with more force than was necessary, the metallic clink drawing Olivia's attention. The girl looked up at Sarah, her wide eyes filled with gratitude, but Sarah had already moved on. Mr. Johnson watched her retreat with a slight frown. He exchanged a look with his wife, who responded with a subtle shake of her head, a silent plea for patience. The flight continued without major incidents until dessert was served. Olivia's eyes lit up when the flight attendant placed a small tub of vanilla ice cream in front of her. "Thank you," she said brightly, her enthusiasm momentarily breaking through the tension. Sarah, passing by, heard the exchange and felt an unexpected pang of annoyance. Moments later, the spoon slipped from Olivia's fingers and clattered to the floor. The sound was barely audible over the hum of the engines, but Sarah was there in an instant. "This isn't a playground," she snapped, her voice sharper than intended. Olivia froze, her hands hovering over her tray as if unsure whether to move. Her eyes welled up with tears, but she blinked them back, unwilling to let them fall. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mrs. Johnson placed a calming hand on her daughter's shoulder and turned to Sarah. "It was an accident," she said, her tone measured but unyielding. Sarah hesitated, momentarily thrown off by the quiet strength in Mrs. Johnson's gaze. But before she could respond, William Grant spoke up from his seat. "Don't take it personally," he said, directing his comment to Sarah but loud enough for others to hear. "Some people just don't understand the decorum expected in places like this." The insinuation hung in the air like a foul odor. Mrs. Johnson's head snapped toward William, her eyes narrowing. "Excuse me?" William raised his hands in mock surrender. "No offense," he said, his smirk betraying the insincerity of his words. Mr. Johnson exhaled sharply, his hands gripping the armrests of his seat. He said nothing, but the tension in his posture spoke volumes. Sarah, caught between embarrassment and an unspoken need to validate William's words, took a step back. "I'm just trying to maintain order," she said weakly. "Order," Mr. Johnson repeated, his voice low and deliberate. "I see." The remainder of the flight passed in uneasy silence. Olivia, once so full of life, now curled into her mother's side, her small frame pressed against the comforting warmth of Mrs. Johnson's arm. Mr. Johnson resumed working on his laptop, though his focus wavered. Sarah avoided their row entirely, busying herself with other passengers and trying to convince herself that she had handled the situation appropriately. But deep down, doubt began to creep in. In the galley, William approached her again, his drink in hand. "You did the right thing," he said, his voice low. "Sometimes people need a reminder of where they stand." Sarah nodded slowly, though her expression was far from confident. As the plane began its descent, Sarah stood at the galley counter, filling out the post-flight report. Her pen hovered over the incidents section. She hesitated, unsure of what to write. "Passenger disturbance," she murmured to herself, frowning. "No, that's not right." The image of Olivia's trembling hands and Mrs. Johnson's calm yet piercing gaze flashed in her mind. For a moment, guilt threatened to surface, but she pushed it down. William passed by on his way back to his seat, pausing briefly to give her an approving nod. "Sometimes," he said, "you have to be the one to keep things in balance." Sarah didn't reply, but his words lingered as she returned to her duties. When she walked past the Johnsons one final time, Olivia looked up at her, the ghost of a smile on her face despite everything. Sarah averted her gaze, her lips pressed into a thin line. The plane landed with a soft jolt, but for Sarah, the turbulence was far from over. As passengers disembarked, the Johnsons walked down the aisle with the same grace they had entered, but now a shadow hung over them. Olivia held tightly to her mother's hand, her steps small and hesitant. Sarah watched them leave, a strange weight settling in her chest. She didn't understand it fully, but she knew this flight would stay with her long after the passengers had gone. The airport terminal was quiet when Sarah stepped off the plane, the echoes of hurried footsteps bouncing off the walls. For the crew, the day wasn't over yet. Debriefings, paperwork, and cleaning awaited before they could finally call it a night. But Sarah barely noticed the routine bustle around her. Her thoughts were consumed by the flight, by the way Mrs. Johnson's unwavering calm felt sharper than any reprimand, by the quiet despair in Olivia's eyes. And yet, beneath the guilt that threatened to bubble up, a stubborn voice lingered. "I was just doing my job." That mantra, however, was soon shattered. "Sarah, can I have a word?" The voice of her supervisor broke through her thoughts. Sarah looked up to find Margaret, the lead cabin manager, standing near the crew lounge. The woman's face was unreadable, but her clipped tone carried a weight that immediately set Sarah on edge. "Of course," Sarah replied, her voice measured. She followed Margaret into a private office, her heartbeat quickening with each step. The room was small, lined with filing cabinets and smelling faintly of stale coffee. Margaret gestured for Sarah to sit, closing the door behind her. "We've had an incident reported from your flight," Margaret began, her tone professional but firm. Sarah blinked, her mind racing. "An incident?" Margaret opened a folder on the desk between them, pulling out a printout of an email. "A passenger complaint, filed by the Johnson family. They claim they were mistreated during the flight, discriminated against specifically." Sarah felt her stomach drop. She forced herself to remain calm. "I don't believe I treated them unfairly," she said carefully. "I was professional at all times." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. "Professional?" she echoed. She slid a second paper across the desk. "This was also brought to our attention. It's going viral as we speak." Sarah's hands trembled as she picked up the paper. It was a printed screenshot of a social media post. The accompanying video still showed her standing stiffly over Olivia, her face tense with disapproval as she snapped something inaudible. The caption beneath read, "This is how first-class passengers are treated, or is it just certain passengers?" The likes and comments were already in the tens of thousands. "I didn't know," Sarah stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. You didn't know someone was recording, or you didn't know how you came across? Margaret's question was pointed. Sarah's face burned. This is serious, Margaret interrupted. We've received multiple complaints from other passengers corroborating their story. And given Mrs. Johnson's position within the company, this could have larger implications. That caught Sarah's attention. Her position? Margaret leaned back in her chair, her expression grim. Mrs. Johnson is a major shareholder in our airline, and her husband's company handles our logistics contracts. This isn't just a disgruntled passenger situation, Sarah. This is a PR nightmare. The words hit Sarah like a blow. Her mind raced, piecing together what this meant. Mrs. Johnson, a shareholder. Mr. Johnson, a key partner. She felt a wave of nausea as she realized the full scope of her actions. Margaret continued, her tone softer, but no less firm. Effective immediately, you're suspended pending an investigation. HR will contact you regarding next steps suspended. The word echoed in Sarah's mind, heavy and final. Hours later, Sarah sat alone in her car in the staff parking lot. The paper with the social media screenshot lay crumpled on the passenger seat beside her. She replayed the events of the flight in her mind, each moment now tinged with regret. Olivia's trembling voice, Mrs. Johnson's cutting calm, Mr. Johnson's controlled anger. It all felt different now, sharper, clearer. Her phone buzzed, jolting her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen to see a text from Linda, one of her junior colleagues on the flight. Linda, are you okay? Saw the video. Let me know if you need to talk. For a moment, Sarah considered ignoring it. But something about Linda's message felt genuine, untainted by the judgment Sarah was certain everyone else was harboring. Sarah, not really. Can we meet? Later that evening, Sarah and Linda sat across from each other at a small cafe near the airport. Linda, young and earnest, looked nervous but determined. I wanted to check on you, Linda began, stirring her tea absently. The video, it's bad, Sarah. I know, Sarah muttered, staring into her untouched coffee. It's everywhere, isn't it? Linda nodded. It's not just the video. People are talking. The crew, the passengers, even some of the higher-ups. They're saying it doesn't look good for you. Sarah exhaled shakily. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I thought I was doing the right thing. Linda hesitated before speaking. I think you let someone else influence you. Sarah frowned. What do you mean? I saw how William Grant kept talking to you, Linda said carefully. He's not exactly subtle about his biases, and I think he used you to make his point. The thought hadn't fully occurred to Sarah before, but now, in hindsight, it seemed obvious. William's whispers, his knowing smirks, the way he nudged her toward conflict, it all came rushing back. He played me, Sarah said bitterly. Linda nodded. Maybe, but the thing is, Sarah, you still acted on it, and now you have to deal with the fallout. The reality of Linda's words settled heavily over Sarah. She couldn't deny it any longer. Her choices had led her here. What do I do? She asked quietly. Linda hesitated, then said, Start by taking responsibility. Admit where you went wrong. And if you really want to fix this, you'll need to do more than apologize. The chapter ends with Sarah sitting alone in her car once again, staring at the crumpled screenshot. For the first time, the weight of her actions truly begins to sink in. The morning sunlight streamed through the blinds, but Sarah barely noticed. She sat hunched over the kitchen table, her hands cradling a lukewarm mug of coffee. The events of the past 24 hours replayed in her mind like a relentless loop, each moment more damning than the last. Her phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, but she couldn't bring herself to look. The buzzing stopped briefly before another sound took its place. A sharp knock at the door. "Sarah?" James, her husband, called out from the other side. "Come in," she muttered. He stepped inside, his face lined with worry and frustration. "The HR department called me," he said without preamble. "They wanted to confirm some details about your suspension." Sarah's stomach twisted. "They're making it official then?" James nodded. "And it's not just you. Word's gotten out. People at my job are talking about it." "What?" Sarah's voice cracked. "I overheard them in the break room," James continued. "They're worried it'll bring bad press to the company. I might not—" He stopped himself, but the weight of his words hung heavily in the air. "You might not what?" Sarah pressed, though she already knew the answer. James exhaled slowly. "I might not have a job soon, Sarah." The words hit her like a physical blow. She sank further into her chair, her mug clattering against the table as she set it down. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she whispered. "I didn't think it would go this far." James's frustration boiled over. "You didn't think? Sarah, how could you not think? You've always been stubborn, but this? You've dragged all of us into this mess." "I know," Sarah shot back, her voice rising. "Do you think I don't know that? Every second since that flight I've been replaying it in my head, wondering what I could have done differently." James shook his head. "It's not about replaying it, Sarah. It's about fixing it. But right now, it feels like all you've done is make it worse." Their argument was cut short by the sound of the doorbell. James went to answer it, leaving Sarah alone in the kitchen once more. Minutes later, James returned, holding a large envelope. He placed it on the table in front of her without a word. "What's this?" Sarah asked. "Legal papers," James replied grimly. "The Johnsons are suing." Sarah stared at the envelope, the reality of her situation tightening around her like a vice. Slowly, she opened it, her eyes scanning the formal language that outlined the lawsuit against her and the airline. The words blurred together, but one phrase stood out: emotional distress and reputational harm. Her hands shook as she set the papers down. "They're suing me personally." James nodded. "And the airline. But yes, you're named." Sarah swallowed hard, the enormity of the consequences finally settling in. Later that day, Sarah ventured out for the first time since her suspension. She kept her head down as she walked through the grocery store, hyper-aware of every glance, every hushed whisper. Isn't that her? The one from the video? Unbelievable. She rushed through her errands, her hands trembling as she fumbled with her wallet at checkout. By the time she returned to her car, she was barely holding it together. Her phone buzzed again. She hesitated before glancing at the screen. Another message. Another threat. Anonymous. "People like you don't deserve second chances. Watch your back." Sarah's breath hitched as she stared at the words. The phone slipped from her grasp, landing with a dull thud on the passenger seat. That evening, as she sat alone in the living room, the sound of James and Emily laughing upstairs felt like a distant memory from a life she no longer recognized. Her daughter's footsteps echoed down the stairs. "Mom!" Sarah looked up to see Emily standing hesitantly in the doorway, clutching a stuffed animal. "Are you okay?" Emily asked softly. Sarah forced a smile. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a little tired." Emily nodded but didn't look convinced. "At school today, some kids said mean things about you. They said you're bad." Sarah's chest tightened. "Oh, honey," she began, but Emily cut her off. "I told them they were wrong," Emily said fiercely. "I told them you're not bad. You're my mum, and you're good." Tears pricked at Sarah's eyes as she opened her arms, and Emily rushed into her embrace. "Thank you, baby," she whispered. The brief moment of solace didn't last. The next day, Sarah received a call from Linda. "We need to meet," Linda said urgently. "Why?" "I found something," Linda replied. "It's about William Grant." In the small cafe where they had met before, Linda slid her phone across the table. On the screen was an email chain with William Grant's name prominently displayed. "What is this?" Sarah asked, her brow furrowing. "It's from the internal system," Linda explained. "He was discussing strategy with another executive before the flight. Look here." She pointed to a line in one of the emails. "If the Johnsons cause any disruptions, escalate. We can use it to our advantage later." Sarah's heart sank. "He set me up," Linda nodded. "He's been playing everyone, and now you're the scapegoat." The revelation was both devastating and oddly empowering. For the first time since the incident, Sarah felt a spark of clarity. "I need to do something," she said quietly. Linda leaned forward. "I can help you, but you need to take the first step. Own what you did, and then fight back." The chapter ends with Sarah sitting alone in her car, staring at the glowing screen of her phone. Linda's email was forwarded to her, the evidence now in her possession. For the first time, Sarah wasn't thinking about what had been done to her. She was thinking about what she needed to do next. The morning sunlight filtered weakly through the curtains, but it did little to brighten Sarah's world. She sat at the kitchen table, staring into a cold cup of coffee. The events of the past week weighed heavily on her, like an anchor pulling her deeper into despair. The suspension from her job, the endless barrage of hate messages, and now the prospect of a lawsuit. It was too much. Her phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up with notifications. She hesitated before picking it up, already bracing for the vitriol she knew she'd see. Anonymous. "What kind of monster treats a kid like that?" Another anonymous person. "You don't deserve to work anywhere ever again." Her chest tightened as she scrolled through dozens of similar messages. Strangers, faceless and emboldened by anonymity, had turned her into a public enemy. Sarah wanted to scream, to defend herself, to make them understand, but she knew it was pointless. Her husband, James, entered the kitchen, his face etched with frustration. He held a cup of coffee, but unlike Sarah's untouched mug, his was half empty, a testament to how much he'd already been dealing with that morning. "They called me into HR yesterday," he said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but the tension beneath was unmistakable. Sarah looked up, dread pooling in her stomach. "What did they say?" James set his cup down with more force than necessary. "They didn't come out and say it, but it's clear. They're worried about the fallout from your situation. They think it's going to reflect badly on me, and by extension, the company." Her heart sank. "Are they going to fire you?" James sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know. But after 12 years, the fact that they're even considering it. Sarah, this isn't just about you anymore." "I didn't mean for this to happen," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. James's patience snapped. "Stop saying that," he shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "You didn't mean for this to happen, but it did. You always act like you're the victim, but have you thought about what this is doing to us? To Emily?" Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, but she held them back. "Of course I've thought about it. Do you think I wanted this? I've been trying to figure out how to fix it, but..." "But what?" James interrupted. "You can't. Not without owning up to what you did. And even then, it might not be enough." The words stung, but Sarah knew he was right. She just didn't know where to start. The sound of the front door opening interrupted their argument. Emily's footsteps echoed through the hall as she dropped her backpack and rushed into the kitchen. Her face was flushed, and her eyes were red from crying. "Mom!" she cried, throwing herself into Sarah's arms. "The kids at school were so mean today." Sarah held her tightly, stroking her hair. What happened, sweetheart? They said you're a bad person, Emily sobbed. They said you're a racist and that Dad's going to lose his job because of you. Sarah's heart shattered. Oh, honey, she whispered. I'm so sorry. I told them they were wrong, Emily said fiercely, pulling back to look her mother in the eye. You're not bad, Mom. You're not. Tears finally spilled down Sarah's cheeks as she kissed her daughter's forehead. Thank you, baby, she said, her voice trembling. Later that afternoon, the doorbell rang. James opened it to find a courier holding a large envelope. Ms. Sarah Carter, the courier asked. James called Sarah to the door, and she approached hesitantly. When she saw the envelope, her stomach churned. This is for you, the courier said, handing it over before leaving. Sarah stared at the envelope, dread coiling in her chest. Slowly, she opened it, her hands trembling as she pulled out the documents inside. Her eyes scanned the pages, the legal jargon blurring together until certain phrases jumped out at her. Emotional distress, reputational damage, punitive damages. They're suing me, she whispered, her voice hollow. James, reading over her shoulder, let out a low whistle. And the airline. But yes, you're named personally. Sarah sank onto the couch, clutching the papers in her lap. How am I supposed to fight this? She murmured. James had no answer. As the day turned into evening, Sarah's phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't hate messages, but a call from Linda. Hey, Linda said cautiously. I wanted to check on you. I'm fine, Sarah lied, her voice flat. I'm not sure I believe that, Linda replied gently. Look, I've been doing some digging, and I think I found something that might help you. What do you mean? I've been looking into William Grant, Linda explained. He's not as untouchable as he seems. I found some internal emails that suggest he was planning something before the flight. He mentioned the Johnsons specifically. Sarah's grip on the phone tightened. What kind of planning? Linda hesitated. He was trying to provoke something. He said if the Johnsons caused any kind of incident, it could be used against them later. I think he knew exactly what he was doing when he egged you on. Sarah felt a mix of anger and betrayal. He set me up, she said through gritted teeth. Yes, Linda agreed. But Sarah, you still made your own choices. This doesn't absolve you. It just means you weren't the only one at fault. Sarah exhaled shakily, her mind racing. What do I do? You need to start by owning your part in this, Linda said firmly. Apologize, not just to the Johnsons, but to yourself. And then we go after William. Sarah wasn't sure she had the strength for any of it, but for the first time she felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her going. The chapter ends with Sarah opening her laptop, staring at a blank document. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she struggled to find the words to begin her apology. The cursor blinked at her, a small but persistent reminder that she had a long way to go. Sarah sat in her car, parked outside the local library, staring at the blinking cursor on her laptop screen. The open document bore a single line. To the Johnson family, she had been sitting like this for over an hour, the rest of the page blank. Words felt like an impossible currency, each one weighed down by the enormity of what she had to say. How could she apologize for something she barely understood herself? Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat, breaking the heavy silence. Linda's name flashed across the screen. Hey, Sarah answered, her voice tight. Did you write it? Linda asked, her tone gentle but insistent. Sarah sighed. I'm trying. You don't need to make it perfect, Linda said. Just make it honest. That's what they need to hear. Sarah glanced at the screen again. Honest, she echoed, her voice hollow. Start with what you feel right now, Linda suggested. Then go from there. The call ended, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts once more. She stared at the screen, the weight in her chest growing heavier. Taking a deep breath, she began typing. The letter was sent the next morning. Sarah didn't reread it before hitting send. She couldn't bear to. The only thing she could do now was wait. The response came faster than she expected. Just 2 days later, Sarah received an email from a name she recognized immediately. Linda Johnson. Subject: an apology. Sarah hesitated before opening it, her heart pounding in her chest. When she finally clicked, the message was brief but clear. Sarah, I have received your letter. While I appreciate the gesture, words alone cannot undo the damage done. If you truly wish to make amends, I suggest we meet. I will have my assistant arrange the details. Linda Johnson. The meeting was set for a Saturday afternoon at a local community center. Sarah arrived early, her palms slick with sweat as she clutched a notebook filled with hastily scribbled notes. She had spent hours preparing what to say, but now, standing outside the door, her mind felt blank. Just breathe, Linda had told her. Be honest. With a deep inhale, Sarah stepped inside. The room was small but inviting, with warm lighting and comfortable chairs. Mrs. Johnson sat at one end of a low table, her posture impeccable. She was dressed simply, but her presence filled the room. Sarah's stomach churned as she approached. Mrs. Johnson, Sarah began, her voice trembling. Ms. Carter, Mrs. Johnson replied, her tone cool but civil. She gestured to the chair opposite her. Please sit. Sarah obeyed, gripping her notebook tightly in her lap. I wanted to thank you for agreeing to meet, Sarah started. I know I don't deserve it, but... You're right, Mrs. Johnson interrupted, her gaze steady. You don't. But this isn't about what you deserve. It's about what's necessary. Sarah swallowed hard. I know I hurt you and your family. I don't even know how to begin to apologize for that. Mrs. Johnson raised an eyebrow. Then why don't you try? Sarah looked down at her notebook, flipping through the pages. But the words she had written suddenly felt hollow, meaningless. She closed it and set it aside. I was wrong, she said simply. I let my assumptions and my biases control me, and I hurt you, your daughter, and your husband because of it. I wish I could take it back, but I know I can't. Mrs. Johnson said nothing, her expression unreadable. Sarah continued, her voice growing steadier. I didn't realize how much damage I was doing until it was too late. And I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want to do whatever it takes to make this right. The silence that followed was heavy. Mrs. Johnson's gaze didn't waver as she considered Sarah's words. Finally, she leaned back in her chair. Do you have children, Ms. Carter? Sarah nodded. A daughter. She's 9. Then perhaps you can understand, Mrs. Johnson said, her tone softening just slightly. Imagine someone making your child feel small, feel unworthy, simply because of who they are. Can you fathom the kind of pain that causes? Sarah's throat tightened as she thought of Emily. No, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I can't. Mrs. Johnson nodded. My daughter is still asking me why it happened, why someone she never met would treat her that way, and I don't have an answer for her. I wish I could give you one, Sarah said, tears brimming in her eyes. But I don't understand it myself. Then perhaps, Mrs. Johnson said, this meeting isn't the end of your journey, but the beginning. The room fell silent again. Sarah wiped her eyes, nodding. What can I do? Tell me how to make it right. Mrs. Johnson studied her for a moment. There's a program I'm involved in. It focuses on addressing biases and fostering understanding in communities. We work with schools, workplaces, and public institutions. If you're truly serious about change, I want you to participate. I'll do it, Sarah said without hesitation. It won't be easy, Mrs. Johnson warned. "You'll be challenged in ways you haven't been before. But if you're willing, it could be a start." Sarah nodded again. "I'll do whatever it takes." The meeting ended with a handshake, firm and formal. As Sarah left the community centre, she felt lighter than she had in weeks. It wasn't forgiveness, Mrs. Johnson had made that clear, but it was a chance. And for Sarah, that was enough. The chapter concludes with Sarah standing outside the centre, looking up at the sky. For the first time, the weight on her chest felt bearable. She still had a long road ahead, but at least now she was walking in the right direction. The community centre was bustling with activity when Sarah arrived for her first day. Children raced through the hallways with unbridled energy. Volunteers handed out meals in the cafeteria, and a group of teenagers gathered in a corner, chatting animatedly over art supplies. The warmth and vitality of the space contrasted sharply with Sarah's inner turmoil. She clutched the strap of her bag tightly, feeling out of place as she made her way to the front desk. "Hi, I'm Sarah Carter," she said, her voice tentative. "I'm supposed to start today?" The receptionist, a cheerful woman named Marisol, smiled warmly. "Welcome, Sarah. We've been expecting you. Let me show you around." Marisol led her through the maze of rooms, explaining the center's mission along the way. "We serve everyone here, families, kids, seniors. A lot of the people who come here have faced challenges like discrimination, poverty, or just feeling invisible. Our goal is to make sure they're seen, heard, and supported." Sarah nodded, the words hitting closer to home than she expected. Her first task was simple: assist with sorting donations in the back storage room. Boxes of clothes, toys, and toiletries lined the walls, and her job was to organize them by category. It was mundane work, but Sarah welcomed the distraction. She focused on folding clothes and stacking neatly labeled boxes, her mind quiet for the first time in weeks. As the hours passed, she began to notice the flow of people moving in and out of the center. A single mother came to pick up school supplies for her kids. An elderly man stopped by to drop off a quilt he had made for donation. A young woman, visibly nervous, asked for help filling out a job application. Each interaction was small, but it carried weight. These weren't just transactions, they were lifelines. Later that afternoon, Sarah was assigned to assist with the after-school program. She was introduced to a group of children, all between the ages of 8 and 12, who were working on a creative writing project. "Everyone, this is Ms. Sarah," said Claire, the program coordinator. Claire was a kind woman in her late 30s with a calm demeanor that immediately put people at ease. The kids greeted Sarah with varying levels of enthusiasm, some with curious smiles, others with shy glances, and a few with open indifference. "Today, we're writing stories about superheroes," Claire announced. "Think about what kind of powers your superhero would have and what makes them special." The room buzzed with energy as the kids grabbed pencils and paper. Sarah walked among the tables, offering encouragement and suggestions. "What's your superhero's name?" she asked a boy with glasses who was furiously scribbling on his paper. "Captain Fix-It," he replied proudly. "He can fix anything, broken toys, broken cars, even broken hearts." Sarah smiled. "That's an amazing power. The world could use someone like Captain Fix-It." As the session continued, Sarah noticed a girl sitting alone at the far end of the room. She was hunched over her paper, her pencil hovering hesitantly above the page. "Hi," Sarah said gently as she approached. "What's your superhero's name?" The girl looked up, her dark eyes wary. "I don't know yet," she said softly. "That's okay," Sarah replied, sitting down beside her. "Sometimes it takes a little time to figure it out. What do you want your superhero to do?" The girl hesitated before answering. "I want her to help people feel safe. Like, if they're scared or lonely, she makes them feel like everything's going to be okay." Sarah's chest tightened. "That's a beautiful idea," she said. "What if her power is kindness? Sometimes being kind can be the strongest power of all." The girl nodded slowly, a small smile forming on her lips. "I think I'll call her Safe Haven." "I love that," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. By the end of the day, Sarah felt drained but also lighter than she had in weeks. The children's creativity and resilience had left an indelible mark on her. For the first time, she felt like she was contributing to something meaningful. The next day, Sarah was tasked with helping in the kitchen, preparing meals for the lunch service. She worked alongside a group of volunteers, chopping vegetables and assembling sandwiches. One of the volunteers, an older woman named Ethel, struck up a conversation as they worked. "You're new here, aren't you?" Ethel asked. Sarah nodded. "This is my second day." "What brought you here?" Ethel's question was casual, but it carried an undertone of curiosity. Sarah hesitated. "I made some mistakes," she admitted. "I hurt people, and I'm trying to make up for it." Ethel paused, her knife resting against a carrot. "Well, you're in the right place. Everyone here has a story, and everyone here is trying to move forward." That afternoon, Sarah's resolve was tested when a heated argument broke out in the dining area. A man, visibly upset, was shouting at one of the staff members about being denied access to a program. "I've been coming here for months," he yelled. "Why can't I get help now?" Sarah watched from the kitchen doorway, unsure of whether to intervene. Claire stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Mr. Daniels, I understand you're frustrated," she said, "but we have guidelines we have to follow, and this situation doesn't meet the criteria." "That's not good enough," the man shouted, his face red with anger. Without thinking, Sarah stepped forward. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. "I know you're upset, but yelling won't solve anything. Let's talk this through calmly, okay?" The man glared at her, his anger momentarily redirected. "And who are you?" "I'm just a volunteer," Sarah said honestly. "But I want to help. Let's figure out a solution together." The tension in the room eased slightly as the man exhaled heavily. "Fine," he muttered, "but this isn't over." Claire gave Sarah a grateful look as she led the man to a private office to continue the conversation. That evening, as Sarah left the center, she felt an unfamiliar sense of accomplishment. She had faced a challenge and handled it with grace, a far cry from the woman who had let her biases dictate her actions just weeks ago. The stars were beginning to dot the night sky as she walked to her car. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was starting to find her footing again. The hum of voices filled the community center's main hall as Sarah arrived for another day of volunteering. The past 2 weeks had been both exhausting and enlightening. Each day brought new challenges, but for the first time in years, Sarah felt a sense of purpose. Her usual shift involved sorting donations or assisting with the after-school program, but today was different. Linda had asked her to sit in on a special session of the center's bias awareness program. The thought filled Sarah with equal parts curiosity and dread. "You'll learn a lot," Linda had said, "but be ready. It's not easy to hear." Sarah took a deep breath as she entered the conference room, finding a seat in the back corner. The session was led by a man named Marcus, a former educator turned community activist. His presence commanded attention not through intimidation, but through quiet confidence. "Let's talk about implicit bias," Marcus began, his voice calm but firm. "The assumptions we make about people based on how they look, speak, or where they come from. These biases aren't always intentional, but they affect our actions, and those actions can have real consequences." He gestured toward a whiteboard where the words intent versus impact were written in bold letters. "You might not mean to hurt someone," Marcus continued, But that doesn't erase the pain you've caused. It's the impact that matters." The room was silent as his words sank in. Sarah felt a pang of guilt as she thought about Olivia and her tear-filled eyes on the plane. Midway through the session, Marcus invited participants to share personal experiences. A young woman named Tasha was the first to speak. "I used to work at a coffee shop," Tasha began. "One day, a customer walked in, a black man wearing a hoodie. He didn't say anything suspicious, didn't act out of the ordinary, but I felt nervous. I kept watching him, thinking he might try to steal something." Her voice wavered. "He caught me staring and asked if something was wrong. I said no, but he knew. He looked me in the eye and said, 'I get it. You don't trust me.'" Tasha paused, her hands trembling slightly. "I felt so ashamed. He didn't do anything wrong, but I made him feel like he didn't belong, like he was a threat just because of how he looked." Sarah's chest tightened as she listened. The situation Tasha described wasn't identical to her own, but the parallels were impossible to ignore. When the session ended, Marcus approached Sarah. "You've been quiet," he said, his tone neutral. Sarah hesitated. "I'm just processing," she replied. "That's a good start," Marcus said, "but don't stop there. Processing is only the first step. The real work comes when you turn those thoughts into action." Sarah nodded, his words resonating deeply. That evening, Sarah found herself reflecting on the session as she walked through the center's main hallway. Her thoughts were interrupted by Claire, who flagged her down. "Sarah, can you help with something?" Claire asked. "We've got a new volunteer who's a little nervous. Could you show her the ropes?" "Of course," Sarah replied. Claire led Sarah to the cafeteria, where a young woman was standing awkwardly by the counter. She looked up as they approached, offering a tentative smile. "Hi," Sarah said warmly. "I'm Sarah. What's your name?" "Amara," the woman replied softly. "Well, Amara, let's get started," Sarah said, gesturing toward the prep station. As they worked together, Amara began to open up. She shared that she had recently moved to the area and was struggling to find her place. "I've always wanted to help people," Amara said, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "But sometimes I feel like I don't belong here, like I'm not good enough." Sarah paused, her heart aching at the vulnerability in Amara's words. "I know that feeling," she admitted, "but trust me, you belong here. The fact that you're here means you're already making a difference." Amara smiled, her shoulders relaxing slightly. The following day brought a new challenge. The center hosted a public forum on racial equity, inviting community members to share their experiences and ideas for change. Sarah was asked to assist with organizing the event, but she wasn't prepared for the emotional intensity of the discussions. One by one, attendees stood up to speak. Some shared stories of discrimination and exclusion, while others offered suggestions for fostering inclusivity. An older man, his voice steady but filled with emotion, recounted how he had been denied housing decades ago because of his skin color. A young mother spoke about her fears for her son, who had already been labeled as trouble by his teachers at just 7 years old. Each story was a reminder of the pervasive impact of bias, how it seeped into every corner of life, leaving scars that often went unseen. Near the end of the forum, Marcus invited Sarah to speak. "You've been doing a lot of listening these past few weeks," he said. "Now's your chance to share." Sarah's heart pounded as she approached the microphone. She glanced out at the sea of faces, some curious, others guarded. "My name is Sarah Carter," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "And I'm here because I made a mistake, a big one. I let my assumptions and biases cloud my judgment, and I hurt people because of it." She paused, taking a steadying breath. "I'm not proud of what I did, but I'm trying to learn from it. Being here, Listening to all of you has opened my eyes to things I didn't understand before, and I know I have a long way to go, but I'm committed to doing the work." The room was silent for a moment before a few people began to clap. The applause grew, filling the space with a warmth Sarah hadn't felt in months. That night, as Sarah left the center, she felt a sense of clarity she hadn't experienced before. For the first time, she understood that accountability wasn't just about apologizing, it was about action, about showing up every day and doing better. The journey was far from over, but Sarah was finally beginning to believe that redemption was possible. The invitation arrived in a crisp, white envelope, its weight somehow heavier than it looked. Sarah held it in her trembling hands, rereading the neatly printed text. "You are cordially invited to attend the Equity and Justice Conference, hosted by the Johnson Family Foundation. Topic: Accountability and Change in Professional Spaces." At the bottom, her name was written in elegant script: Sarah Carter, Special Guest Speaker. The words stared back at her like a challenge. Linda had insisted she attend, but the idea of standing in front of a room full of people, including the Johnson family, and speaking about her failures, felt impossible. "What if I say the wrong thing?" Sarah had asked. Linda had smiled knowingly. "Then you say the wrong thing. What matters is that you show up and try." The conference hall was bustling when Sarah arrived. Rows of chairs faced a large stage, adorned with banners displaying the foundation's logo. The audience was a mix of corporate leaders, community advocates, and individuals who had come to hear stories of change and resilience. Sarah stood near the entrance, gripping the lanyard with her name on it. She felt out of place, her nerves threatening to overwhelm her. "Ms. Carter?" Sarah turned to see a young woman with a clipboard. "Yes?" "The Johnsons would like to meet with you before the session begins," the woman said. Sarah's stomach flipped. "Of course," she replied, forcing a smile. The meeting room was small but impeccably arranged. Mrs. Johnson stood near a table, reviewing notes while Mr. Johnson adjusted his tie. Olivia sat in a chair, her legs swinging idly, but she looked up and smiled faintly when Sarah entered. "Ms. Carter," Mrs. Johnson said, her tone neutral. "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for inviting me," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. Mrs. Johnson gestured to a chair. "Please, sit." Sarah sat down, folding her hands in her lap to keep them from shaking. "We've reviewed your statement," Mrs. Johnson began, "and we appreciate the effort you've made to understand the impact of your actions. But I want to be clear, this isn't about redemption. This is about responsibility." "I understand," Sarah said softly. "Good," Mrs. Johnson replied, "because today isn't about us. It's about the people in that room who are looking for real solutions. If you can offer them even a fraction of the insight you've gained, then maybe something good can come from all of this." Sarah nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of Mrs. Johnson's words. When it was time for her to speak, Sarah felt the full weight of the moment as she stepped onto the stage. The room fell silent, hundreds of eyes fixed on her. "My name is Sarah Carter," she began, her voice trembling. "And I am here because I made a mistake, a terrible one." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the audience. "I let my biases dictate my actions. I allowed assumptions and prejudices to cloud my judgment, and as a result, I hurt a family who did nothing to deserve it." Her voice broke slightly, but she pressed on. "In the months since that incident, I've had to face the consequences of my actions. I lost my job, my reputation, and for a while I thought I'd lost myself. But the truth is, those consequences pale in comparison to the pain I caused." Sarah took a deep breath, her hands gripping the podium. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness. I'm here to share what I've learned, in the hope that it might prevent someone else from making the same mistakes." She went on to describe her time at the community center, the lessons she'd learned from listening to others, and the ways she was working to change. "I've realized that accountability isn't about saying, 'I'm sorry,' and moving on," she said. "It's about showing up every day and doing the work to be better. It's about making sure that your actions reflect the person you want to be, not the person you were." When she finished, the room was silent for a moment before applause erupted. It wasn't loud or raucous, but it was steady, and Sarah felt a flicker of hope ignite in her chest. After the session, several attendees approached Sarah to thank her for sharing her story. A young man who worked in corporate HR told her he planned to use her example in his next training seminar. A woman who ran a local non-profit invited Sarah to speak at one of their upcoming events. But the most meaningful moment came when Olivia approached her, flanked by her parents. "Hi, Ms. Carter," Olivia said shyly. Sarah knelt down to meet her eye level. "Hi, Olivia." The little girl hesitated before reaching out and taking Sarah's hand. "Thank you for saying you were sorry," she said softly. "I think it's brave." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she squeezed Olivia's hand. "Thank you for saying that," she whispered. "It means more than you know." As the conference drew to a close, Sarah found herself standing beside Mrs. Johnson near the exit. "You did well," Mrs. Johnson said, her tone softer than it had been earlier. "Thank you," Sarah replied. Mrs. Johnson studied her for a moment. "Redemption is a long road, Ms. Carter," she said, "but you've taken the first step." Sarah nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I won't stop walking it," she promised. That evening, as Sarah drove home, she reflected on the day's events. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of peace. She knew she couldn't undo the past, but she also knew she had the power to shape her future. The journey wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time, Sarah believed she was headed in the right direction. The weeks following the conference were a blur of activity for Sarah. Invitations to speak at local events and workshops poured in, and while she hesitated at first, Linda's gentle encouragement convinced her to accept. "You've started something good, Sarah," Linda said. "Don't let the momentum stop now." Though the fear of public scrutiny lingered, Sarah forced herself to keep moving forward. Each event became an opportunity to share her story, not as a cautionary tale, but as a testament to the possibility of change. One afternoon, as she prepared for a presentation at the community center, Sarah received a message that stopped her in her tracks. Subject: follow-up from the Johnson Family Foundation. She opened the email cautiously, her heart pounding. It was a formal invitation to a private gathering at the Johnsons' home, a thank you dinner for those involved in the conference. Sarah stared at the screen, her mind racing. The invitation felt surreal, like a test she wasn't sure she could pass. But after a moment of hesitation, she typed a simple response. "Thank you. I'd be honored to attend." The evening of the dinner arrived quickly. Sarah stood outside the Johnsons' home, a beautiful yet understated property that radiated warmth and elegance. She smoothed her dress, took a deep breath, and rang the doorbell. The door opened to reveal Olivia, her face lighting up with a smile. "Hi, Ms. Carter." "Hi, Olivia," Sarah said, her nerves easing slightly at the girl's cheerful demeanor. Mrs. Johnson appeared behind her daughter, her expression composed but not unkind. "Welcome, Ms. Carter. Please come in." Sarah stepped inside, taking in the cozy atmosphere. The living room was filled with soft light and the scent of a home-cooked meal. A few other familiar faces from the conference were already mingling, their laughter filling the space. The dinner was a surprisingly relaxed affair. Seated at the long dining table, Sarah listened intently as the guests shared stories about their experiences with the foundation. Each story underscored the power of resilience and the importance of creating spaces where people felt seen and valued. When it was her turn to speak, Sarah hesitated before raising her glass. "I just want to say thank you," she began, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "Thank you for giving me the chance to learn and grow. Being here tonight, it means more to me than I can put into words." The table erupted in polite applause, but the moment that truly mattered came after the meal, when Mrs. Johnson pulled Sarah aside. "You've come a long way," Mrs. Johnson said, her tone softer than Sarah had ever heard it. "But I hope you know this is just the beginning." "I do," Sarah replied, "and I'm committed to continuing the work." Mrs. Johnson nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "There's something else I wanted to tell you. Olivia, she's been asking about you. She wanted to know why someone would choose to change." Sarah's chest tightened. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that sometimes people need a second chance to get things right," Mrs. Johnson said, "and that the important thing is what they do with that chance." Tears pricked at Sarah's eyes, but she blinked them back. "Thank you for believing I could be better," she said quietly. Mrs. Johnson's lips curved into a faint smile. "You're earning that belief, Ms. Carter." In the weeks that followed, Sarah's journey continued to unfold. She became a regular speaker at the Johnson Family Foundation's events, sharing her story and encouraging others to confront their own biases. Her words resonated deeply, sparking conversations and inspiring change in the communities she reached. At the community center, Sarah's role expanded. She began leading workshops on empathy and inclusion, drawing on her own experiences to guide others. The work was challenging but rewarding, and each session felt like another step toward healing, not just for herself, but for those she worked with. One afternoon, as Sarah finished a workshop, she noticed Amara waiting near the door. "Hey, Amara," Sarah said warmly. "What's up?" "I just wanted to say thank you," Amara replied, her voice earnest. "You've helped me feel like I belong here. I never thought I'd have the confidence to volunteer, but you showed me it's okay to try." Sarah smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "You're doing amazing, Amara. Keep going. You've got so much to offer." The young woman nodded, her eyes shining. "So do you," she said, before walking away. Months later, Sarah stood in front of a packed auditorium, preparing to deliver the keynote speech at the Foundation's annual gala. The event was a culmination of the year's work, celebrating the progress made and the challenges still ahead. As she looked out at the audience, Sarah's gaze landed on the Johnson family seated in the front row. Olivia waved enthusiastically, and Mrs. Johnson gave a small nod of encouragement. Sarah took a deep breath and began. "When I think about where I was a year ago, it's hard to believe I'm standing here today," she said. "Back then, I was lost. I let my fears and assumptions guide me, and I caused pain that I can never fully take back. But what I've learned is that change is possible. Not easy, but possible." She paused, her voice growing stronger. Accountability is about more than saying, "I'm sorry." It's about action. It's about showing up day after day and doing the work to be better. And it's about listening, really listening, to the people we've hurt and the communities we want to help. The audience was silent, hanging on her every word. "I'm not perfect," Sarah continued. "I never will be. But I've learned that perfection isn't the goal. Progress is, and I'm grateful to everyone who has given me the chance to make that progress, to start over, and to try again." When she finished, the room erupted in applause. Sarah stepped back from the podium, her heart pounding but full. As the night drew to a close, Sarah found herself outside, looking up at the stars. The air was crisp, carrying with it a sense of renewal. She had come a long way, but she knew her journey was far from over, and that was okay. For the first time, Sarah felt at peace, not because everything was perfect, but because she had found her purpose. And this time, she wasn't walking the path alone. As Sarah stood outside the gala, the cool night air brushing against her skin, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. The path she had walked, the mistakes she had made, the pain she had caused, and the work she had done to atone, had led her here. It wasn't a destination, but a milestone, a reminder that every step mattered. Looking up at the stars, she thought about the people she had met along the way. Olivia's innocent bravery, Linda's unwavering support, and Mrs. Johnson's firm but fair guidance. Each of them had taught her something invaluable, that the world could be better, not through perfection, but through kindness, accountability, and understanding. Sarah turned and walked back into the gala, the sound of applause still echoing in her mind. She knew her story wasn't just hers. It was a story about everyone's ability to change, to grow, and to contribute to a more compassionate world. What about you? Have you ever faced a moment that challenged your assumptions or forced you to reconsider your actions? Sarah's journey reminds us that mistakes are inevitable, but what defines us is how we respond to them. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What lessons from Sarah's story resonate with you? How do you think we can all work toward creating a more understanding and empathetic world? Share your perspective in the comments below. Your voice matters. If Sarah's story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We share powerful, heartfelt stories like this one to inspire kindness, understanding, and hope. Don't miss the chance to be part of a growing community dedicated to spreading positivity and making a difference. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for sharing these moments with us. Together, we can build a world where compassion triumphs over judgment and where every story has the power to create change. See you in the next story.